So, contest prep. On paper, it's pretty straightforward. Lift weights, don't eat that much, keep doing it, get shredded. And most people acknowledge, if they know the game of bodybuilding, that the mental aspect of it is a huge component. The barrier to most people getting on stage is whether they can, quote unquote, hack it. But that's not just to say that it's who can be the best at white knuckling it. I think that is people's maybe first time experience. And I think that might be what's glorified in our little bodybuilding world. But I think the reality is that we've learned as competitors and coaches and just mentors to people going through this process, or any long-term difficult fat loss phase, is that there are certain habits, strategies, tactics, some of them short-term, some of them long-term, which you kind of always maintain, which can make the process far more likely to succeed. So I'm excited to be joined by none other than Steve Taylor, MS, RD, all-around great guy. I think that's AAGG. And also Coach Alberto Nunez to talk about this today. So welcome, guys.
Thank you for having us, Eric.
on our own podcast. Yeah, they're like, you've been on too many Iron Culture episodes, bro. So, all right. So let's talk about just habits in general. So Steve, you actually put out a great blog post recently for 3DMJ. Thank you for that. Let's talk about, in your mind, what do you see as habits? Kind of introduce us to that topic a little bit. How do you broach this subject when you're dealing with it generally?
Describe again exactly what you want me to talk about.
You're fired. That's it. Okay. No, I'm just kidding. No, just when you're discussing the habits with your clients that they have and things you want to change, how do you start that conversation? Like, how do you broach that topic? Because I think a lot of people view habits maybe differently than a nutrition coach does. You know, they don't necessarily even evaluate what they do on a day-to-day basis and how it interacts with food necessarily.
Well, I mean, I guess starting like habit-wise, I don't know, the way I guess I kind of get going with people is like we get going and then we find a barrier and basically we see that they do something in their day that is getting in the way of them reaching their goals. And then from there we can kind of unpack, okay, well, why do you do that thing? Sometimes it's literally just they made a decision years ago and it's kind of been just on autopilot. And so there is no like emotional connection. It's just literally a decision they made and they've just been running that. Other times it's a way they deal with stress, or like a way to unwind after work, or a way to deal with anxiety. So that is typically how I do it, is like, let's get rolling, see what is getting in the way. Typically it is some sort of habit. And then, okay, let's look at that habit. Let's look at why you do that habit. And then let's find a replacement for that habit that supports your goals.
That's perfect. Because I think, Steve, what I wanted to get at there was that some habits may just be habitual. Like, I don't know, I do this because I do it, you know? But there are plenty of habits which fit a emotional or at least a practical need in our lives. And I think sometimes coaches who want to focus on like changing habits, they just kind of get a list of things that people who are lean do. You know, like here's some habits, is like eat more vegetables. And it's like, that's not really habit change, bro. Like, that's just telling someone to eat more vegetables. Like, we have to evaluate at an individual level, why is someone doing what they're doing? And if you can have very divergent reasons for that. So I think that's a really key thing you touched on there. So let's briefly talk about that. Why does it matter if someone has a habit that they're doing for a reason versus something that has just kind of become a funky part of their algorithm? Steve-O.
Well, I would say if somebody has something they're doing for a reason and it's something that is going against their goals, then they're going to constantly be like white knuckling it, as you described, because they're constantly going to be like, okay, I do this thing because I get nervous, but it's actually causing something in my life that's going against my goals. So it's like, unless we address that habit, like, it's either going to be really hard to like keep fighting that thing, or it's just going to keep popping up and getting in the way of their goals. That's why that article was all about. Like, I've just found like through experience, it's much easier to like find an alternative habit for something than to just say, hey, don't do that thing anymore. Because like when somebody gets nervous, if you just say, hey, like, just stop smoking or just stop eating, but they don't know. Then they're just sitting there and they're nervous, and it's like, well, what are they supposed to do? Like,
Yep.
yeah, like sometimes you can wait it out, but like sometimes you need some other like method to get out of that space. And so that's why it's like I've just found that an alternative typically works better than just saying, hey, just don't do that.
No, that's a perfect explanation. It's like it seems simple to me, but I think some people might really have not thought it through, that some of the things you do that you don't like, that you wish you didn't do, actually do serve a functional purpose. They might not help you with your long-term goals, but they certainly help you achieve something in the short term. One of the most obvious ones is someone who is trying to lose weight, but who tends to eat in response to stress. So you're a quote unquote emotional eater. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't eat for emotional reasons. There's nothing wrong with that. However, if it is something that's actively getting in the way of your goals, like you said, Steve, then some people are like, all right, well, I need to stop doing that. Well, how? And even if you were successful, how do you deal with that emotional stress? If you don't have other tools, if you don't know to, meditate or journal or call your mom, whatever it might be for you, you have to do something to manage that stress in your life because you found a coping strategy. Unfortunately, that coping strategy doesn't mesh with your goals. So I think that's a nice little primer so we can understand kind of the basis of how to evaluate habits and what might be a good tool to replace them. Now, here's where the rub comes in, and that's you, Berto. You're the rub. And that's contest prep, all right? So for contest prep, I think this is something that we often see. Like we'll see some people who walk around relatively lean, but they're essentially living that contest prep life, The eating patterns that some people fall into during contest prep, which can be very facilitative. Those habits are there to address specific needs that are temporary, hopefully, if you're doing it right during contest prep. The kind of hunger we deal with, the need for precision, the stuff we do to try to not only support training, but also support a slightly less food-focused or hunger-filled lifestyle. I think that might be some useful perspective. So I think, Berto, I'd love to hear from you, your general thoughts on the habits which make sense to maintain during prep, which maybe don't make sense to maintain outside of prep. And then we can also start talking about the things that maybe we should be doing in our off season differently that should carry over. So let's start there. I know that's a big can of worms, but I know you got a can opener, my friend.
Yeah. Well, kind of playing off what Steve said first, because the goal of getting on stage and the leanness requirements are just so out there for most people. And this is regardless of division now, I think. Like it used to be like, hey, you could just be a men's physique dude. Hey, you could just do bikini, but they all evolve and develop and they almost look like bodybuilding with slightly different poses and slightly different priority in regards to which muscles, right? Like Steve, it's like, where are you now? I think that's really important when someone wants to do this whole contest prep thing, because quite often we have to break it to them that, hey, this is too many quantum leaps away right now. There's all these things that we have to sort out in the middle before, otherwise it's going to be brutal. It's going to make no sense to you. And we're probably going to, delay your growth when it comes to forming the habits that we want you to have when you do contest prep. So yeah, quite often, I think all of us coaches will hear 3D Muscle Journey. It's like there's a huge chunk of people who were like, you know what? I think this timeline makes more sense because it's going to give us more time to work on just some of the prerequisites in regards to habits and skills that you might have skipped out on. Mm-hmm. So yeah. So this person, okay, they got that out the way. They're doing their contest prep thing now. There's just so many things.
You want me to give you a more direct entry point?
Yeah, because it's like, wow, there's this, there's that. Some people might even find out that something, not always the case, but sometimes it does happen that you discover during you did mention this during contest prep that you're like, you know what, they're worth keeping in. Yep. This makes a lot of sense. But yeah, let's pick apart a specific angle.
So here's one for you is, and And these are, I think these are helpful because sometimes they seem like contradictions to what we might generally recommend or what is generally recommended in the quote unquote evidence-based community. For example, meal timing. Here's one that I think is pretty useful to use as a foil. Generally, if someone is trying to gain muscle strength and support their training, the guidance is eat at least 3 times per day, roughly spread your protein, and that's about it. Meal timing, not a huge deal for your chest and back day. During contest prep, it's not necessarily from a energetic standpoint, but I really do recommend most of my athletes when they're home and operating in their normal quote unquote environment to have roughly set meal schedule, at least a number of meals per day, so they can get into this habituated pattern. I find personally that is a really good way to kind of create a structure for the day and more consistent weigh-ins, more consistent performance, and a more consistent feeling so that we can kind of have a baseline to operate from. So that's just one example, Berto. Are there other things that you find you like to institute as far as structure or patterns that you find really are facilitative to the contest prep process that is not something you would be like at a general seminar, like, hey, who wants to get jacked and huge? Well, you need to have a big salad at night, type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Predictability over the course of the day, the week, and I think this extends to things outside of just eating. So, for example, enough sleep or having a sleep schedule that, maybe isn't as naughty as it might be in the off season when you can get away with it. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the biggest one is and it kind of you kind of find yourself doing it anyways. I think especially the first few times where if anything, most of us turn too much into a hermit when we're getting to the grindy part of a contest prep. But some of it might be, I think, warranted the first few times you go about that. And then, over time we can probably make it a little bit more pliable and have date night up until a certain point, things like that. But initially it's like, I think maybe after once we're at the 12 to 16 week mark, maybe we just, you can say no to things every once in a while. Like you don't have to do this. You don't have to do that. I think that's a big one that, the bodybuilders we grew up with, like that was, remember the Animal Pack ads, which I think a lot of our listeners are probably too young to recall. Like that's what they were based upon, was the fact that, hey, I'm just have my head down and I'm just going to get to work and forget about everything else in life because I have these goals. I think during a contest prep, to a certain extent, you do kind of have to pick your battles a little bit more, especially the first few times. And once you've kind of been through that, then we can be a little bit more pliable. But yeah, and especially with the flexible dieting revolution, I think that was a big one initially when, we kept having those conversations with athletes that, hey, just because like Matt Ogus finds himself at an IHOP like on a random Wednesday doesn't mean you have to do that, or not yet, anyways. So yeah, just I guess big lifestyle changes across the board, but that's just kind of how it is at a certain point when you are an athlete, I feel. And for a lot of people, this is probably their first experience where they there's a lot of non-athletes that decide to do this bodybuilding thing, it seems. So, they haven't, I guess, like lived that sort of lifestyle yet. At least not compared to how it might have been, since we've kind of loosened up the reins a bit in regards to like what things you have to check off in the off season in order to have a successful off season. Other things, that's kind of besides the point, but I like, and this actually, no, we're going to work on things that don't translate over to the off season.
We'll get there though.
Yeah. I'd say probably choice of foods is probably a big one. As long as it doesn't get too funny and we're not, eating 3-pound bowls of just fiberish glop throughout the day. It's definitely something where, maybe in the off season, it's like you encourage them to have a more inclusive diet, or it's like, hey, you could have your baseline foods, the more typical stuff, but hey, include some of the things you do like in there, because food isn't just for function. We should enjoy what we eat. And during a prep, it does become one of those things where it's like, hey, maybe um, that pre-workout Snickers bar that you have, maybe that should turn into something that just makes you feel a little better throughout your whole training session. Um, so the diet at a certain point, kind of depending on the person, probably is going to look a little bit less inclusive than I would like as a long-term habit.
Mm-hmm. No, I there's some couple key points that have the same theme that you talked about there. So one, you talked about contest prep length early on in what you were saying, Berto, and I've been a little frustrated by the recent conversation that's kind of boiled down to, oh, should we be dieting longer or should we be dieting shorter and more aggressively? And my first thought is like, for who? Like there's not a universal answer. There should not be a universal answer for that. So certain people settle at different levels of body comp in the off season that they can sustain and sanity on and grow muscle on, and certain people have more or less challenge losing body fat at different rates depending on how much muscle they seem to lose and how it affects their lives and their sanity. And some people have a lot more stress in the experience of carrying out the exact same protocol than someone else based on their experience and their lifestyle. So contest prep, the answer is not short or long. The answer is what's appropriate for the person. And yeah, two different, coaches who are both good might start from two different kind of baselines, but it should be adjusted to the individual. If it's not, and you just have a general blanket answer for everybody, that's not a good way to go. But another thing I really like that you said there is you started to dive into food selection and food choices. And I was thinking about this. I was thinking like, there are a couple of different sets of habits or habitual diet choices that we typically see in bodybuilders. Some, it kind of looks a lot more like the macronater approach, where it has a lot more variety, a lot more typically non-kosher foods. And I don't actually mean kosher. I mean like non-bodybuilding approved foods, like working in a lot more, like non-fat frozen yogurt, and there's a minimal amount of fruits and vegetables to kind of feel like I did my job, but everything else is much more just kind of worked in. You might find yourself, oh, I need to eat lunch. Let me go to Safeway and let me just scan the aisles and then check out my MyFitnessPal and see what I need to hit. And then for others, they have this structured baseline approach that is kind of fundamentally based around lean proteins, fruits, vegetables, whole carb sources, and then things are added to that, or it's adjusted if they are not at home. And I'm trying to think like, which would I prefer? Like if I had to have a baseline, or if I had to have a client who settled in one way or the other, and they both have their pros and cons. Like for myself, I have now settled into kind of the latter approach. I used to be definitely like the macronator, but now I find myself like, I know that if I'm left to my own devices, and let's say just for some reason that Barb goes on a trip for 3 weeks, I'm probably gonna be eating out very like less. I'll be less social, and I'll probably lose a kilo over 3 weeks. And that's probably not ideal for someone who is like an early stage or intermediate who plans to compete next year and is in their off season, because I'm kind of roughly settling around a slight calorie deficit if I don't intervene. However, I find for like the macronator, they tend to be slightly on the other opposite end of the spectrum. They slightly slide towards a surplus, and I think it's easy for them because they're always looking on what can fit, what do I like to eat, and there's a little less habituation. So let me ask you this, Berto, is which would you rather have in a client? Would you rather have someone more towards one end of the spectrum or the other? And in what circumstances would you try to influence them towards one or the other?
Ooh, man, I think so. The nice setup, by the way. I think I know what you did there. So the macronator, he could probably learn a little bit more from the slightly more militant dieter. That probably food preps. His stuff is all set up just in case. Whatever happens, stuck in traffic. It's like my food's right there. It's like right besides me. So with those folks, things tend to go. We tend to have less oops moments over the course of a contest prep where, I didn't prepare, and then by the time I got to eating, I couldn't stop eating things of that nature. So yeah, most people who are really, really pliable in that sense, come contest prep, they can probably benefit from having some sort of skeletal structure, and kind of, basing things around that. And then the other way around, I think, for the person who is in just living the life, so to speak, the bodybuilding lifestyle, where it makes things really predictable and I think easy on my end, but at the same time, for the sake of longevity and given how long you can do the sport for, and how many years of improvement, no matter how small they are, like how long that run is, it's like you probably want something a bit more inclusive for the sake of ensuring that, hey, we have a really long career. So like everything else, there's this middle ground that, people tend to avoid. I'm pretty pliable in the off season myself. Mind you, I kind of know what I should feel like at about every 5 pounds, like I know what 175 should feel like. I know what 180 should feel like, whether it's going up or down. But come contest prep time, I like to think I'm a pretty boring dieter in that, for the most part, things look the same. I might switch around a few things. Oh, I've never tried this Greek yogurt. Let's give this a go. But I like predictability, and I like to have, everything. Because I've had oops moments where, because something went it ended up being a not so good day, and that can really play with your head when you're deep into a contest prep. So yeah, that middle ground, man. That's and then of course, depending on where you are, it's going to slide a little bit more this way, a little bit more that way. Obviously, deep into a prep, we probably want to be super predictable. Might not be a bad idea to pack a few meals if you leave the house. And then, hey, deep into an off season, I think especially if you're a young male with a lot of growth potential, what might help us, for a number of reasons actually, gain the muscle we want to gain. It's going to be having a diet that's a little bit tastier, that's easier to digest, and it just helps you keep your head on straight, man. Because I love food, man. I mean, just like everyone else, like we all derive pleasure from doing that one thing. So we evolved to be that way, right? Else we wouldn't be here, right? So yeah, it's that middle ground, man. But like I said, it's hard for people to really understand that that's where you maximize things.
Really quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcast app may be. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, and it supports our mission of helping as many people as we can to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts that they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and wouldn't be dangerous, pause this thing right now and give us an honest review over on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Steve, I'd love to hear your kind of philosophy and approach you take at different times with different clients of when you try to shift that spectrum either more towards one or the other.
Okay. Basically, I have a collection of thoughts based on this conversation on like short-term habits and some of the things both you guys were touching on. Basically, like what I will do, I guess I'll take this two different ways. I definitely have certain like short-term habits that we put into place during a fat loss phase that I want to get away from in a maintenance phase, even when setting up like long-term habits. So kind of sometimes to like set the stage for all of that, I'll have somebody like list out all the different areas in their life, and then I'll have them kind of like rank those areas in order of importance. And then I'll be like, okay, sometimes it's easier for growth if we just focus on like one or two to like grow those areas. This way we're not like trying to take on too much at one time. So like if you're going through this program, then like maybe like kind of getting your health and fitness in order is like one of those things that like you're wanting to kind of like focus on right now, which means it might get more of like your overall life pie than you want to give it long term. So basically we'll set it up that way. And so during a fat loss phase, basically at the end of a fat loss phase, like I want to have somebody like weighing themselves as little as possible, or basically not at all. Like if somebody's like done with a fat loss phase and they're in maintenance, like if it's literally just like maintenance, then like they don't need to be weighing themselves except for like very, very rarely. Like I love to get to that point. Short-term habits during the fat loss phase might be like, okay, I still want them to like have the habit of like building in like more activity throughout the day, but to get the deficit we need, the energy deficit, they might have to do like more walking than is like sustainable long term. Like if I have somebody doing like 15,000 steps, like that's a ton of steps. Like no one would want to walk 15,000 steps every day forever, but like sometimes that's necessary even for like somebody who's not trying to get crazy lean, to keep their calories to where they're not getting super low. Because that's like one thing I'm always trying to balance out, is because like my focus is always like the long term. Like I found that like I want to keep the calories high enough to where it's like they can still develop like long-term eating habits. Because like if I take the calories too low, then yeah, they learn all these strategies about how to keep their calories super low, but like that's not always helpful at the end of the whole thing. Where it's like if I can at least keep everyone like at 1,500, for example, then it's like, okay, that's like, you can still do stuff with that. Like you can still go out to eat, you can still do these things. But yeah, I don't know, I guess where I was going with that, but that's one thing, is like some of those little things. Another thing is like fruits and veggies. Like Berto kind of mentioned, like fruits and veggies. I have minimum targets that I give people, and like it's cool if like that obviously goes above those minimum targets. But then like just because like a decent amount of the people who find me through the 3DMJ community, I don't want to end and get to like a maintenance place if their fruits and veggies are crazy high. Like I don't want to leave someone where it's like they're going to be having to eat these massive salads to like sustain their weight. But I am cool if like the veggies get decently high during the fat loss phase. So those are kind of the three things that come to my mind. That was a little jumbled, but like by the end of a fat loss phase, like I love like not a lot of weighing, like weighing their body weight. Fruits and veggies to be like in a like normal range where they're not crazy high, but it's cool if they get high during kind of that phase. And then just the activity side, like I still want them to build these habits of like moving around, being more active, but it might have to get higher than that it would be sustainable to get the weight off.
Mm-hmm. No, that wasn't jumbled at all, Stephen. I think you opened up a really, I think the core element of, you have these habits that specifically aren't sustainable during the digging phase of a contest prep, where, you know, let's be honest, I don't care how flexible you think you're being, when your macros are like 120 grams of carbs, 40 grams of fat, and 200 grams of protein, it's going to look a certain way, and it's going to be a lot of broccoli, a lot of chicken breast, and not a whole lot else, you know, and insert a couple fruit, swap out the broccoli for something else. Oh, I'm getting crazy today, I'm eating canned tuna. Very exciting. So that's great. But then when you start to shift towards eating more, whether that is a refeed day during contest prep, or whether that is you're starting to, you know, eat up into your show, or even your exit strategy post-season, you probably don't want to maintain that behavior, but you don't want to completely abandon it either, you know? So it is this kind of dial that you have to learn how to turn to where the, you know, certain level of macros can look different, and that may be less or more facilitative towards your goals. So I think when someone is diced to their socks and they are trying to actually eat up into a show, you don't totally change your diet as you start adding in some more of these amounts of carbs and fats, because you don't want to start getting hungrier, which can actually happen as you add food, you know. But at the same time, you want to eat up into your show, you know, not burn in fiber. You want to actually get some more glycogen stored, and you need to make some changes. So I think there's a fine balance to, at what point do you start to swap out food sources or just have more of the same. And I think there's some probably some relationships between the people who lose weight on a refeed or gain weight on refeed. It has something to do with that. I do think people who maintain a whole lot of fruit, vegetables, and then just add a little bit of carbs on top of that for their refeeds, those typically are people who gain weight on a refeed. But the people who switch to a whole bunch of energy-dense foods, they will typically lose weight. And that's literally just because they're eating less weight of foods. And I find those are also the people who report, you know what, I actually get hungry on my refeed days. Because we've got actually a fair amount of data to suggest that a large aspect, not all of the aspects that influence this, but a large aspect of how much food do you eat habitually if left to your own devices comes to the weight of the food. If you eat 2 pounds of food, you're probably going to keep eating 2 pounds of food. And then if you change the composition of it, that can result in a calorie deficit or surplus based on the energy density. Again, not the only thing, but it is a thing that influences satiety mechanically and also has a direct influence on weight. One of the strategies, my first tier of making weight, and this is a total tangent, but just to kind of illustrate it, for making weight for a powerlifting meet is for 2 to 3 days before the meet, simply replacing fruits, vegetables, and complex carbs with dark chocolate. That's how I go from 95 to 93. That's how Barb recently just made weight for her bench only comp. She dropped, about 800 grams. And it's literally, if you think about it, an apple, a salad, and a chicken breast, that's like a 1 pound meal, But you can have 70 grams of dark chocolate that gets you a similar amount of calories, and then a protein shake, and you just lost, like 300 grams of weight. Boom, right there. So I think you do that for a couple meals, and you can very quickly find how this can modify the scale weight and what we see on refeed days. So anyway, bit of a tangent, bit of all over the place. But Berto, anything more you want to say on the topic of what food sources you like to manipulate at different time points in prep or transitions, or things that you do want in place from the off season going into prep maybe?
I think a big one, I think especially now with all the tools that we have available when dieting, and I'm talking about those weird foods that are, I don't know, like pita breads that are low calorie, things like that, right? As helpful as they can be on paper, I think there's just a certain point where it's like, hey, like let's not lean on labels too much. Actually, an old friend of mine posted, it was called a Bolani bread.
I remember this.
They're popular in the Bay. He posted it the other day. He's like, if you know, you know. And I remember we were having trouble having him lose weight, and he pops up his fridge very proudly, and he's like, "Look at these things. They're like 70 calories," and it's like, there's no way. There's no way. So yeah, I'd say some of those foods that on literally on paper on the nutritional label might seem friendly. It's like there's just a certain point where, especially when you're really trying to pull in those last few pounds, it's like let's maybe not lean on those too much. I know that for me, once I get close enough, it's like those things gotta go.
So you're talking about foods where there is potential ambiguity as to the accuracy of the label claims, right?
Yeah.
So where it's like a small company making a unique food, putting it together and kind of slapping a label on there versus something like a large apple.
Yeah. And we've all been there. We've all eaten those foods where you're like, this is too good to be true, but this is just like too good to put down, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when you're lean and hungry. So that, that's probably something that, I would probably just go over with my athlete at a certain point, especially if we're having a little bit of trouble. And especially they seem to be suffering a little bit, because usually the ones that are really starting to feel it, they tend to resort to those things a lot more. So yeah, that's one. And then the other way around, sometimes you get so caught up in those habits of being that meticulous and that precise in regards to like what's in your food that I know coming out of my first few preps, that bothered me a lot, where I didn't know the exact macronutrient and caloric breakdown of certain foods. Like that took some retraining the first few times.
Yep.
But
Berto, I just want to note there's something. I think people go two different directions when they get hungry and prep. Some people are actively aware that they just want to eat more, and they start looking at foods and they go, okay, how do I get larger portion sizes without going over my macros? And then other people, they look for things to basically fit their cravings, right? They try to look for the low calorie ice cream options, or they're the ones eating Arctic Zero back when we all knew it was terrible. But you know, when you can taste the sugar in tomato sauce, that's when things are going to go bad. So I think people who go those two different directions, there's a different coaching strategy for both of them, in my opinion. Because the people who are just like, yeah, so I ate a pound of broccoli today, I'm like, oh my God, I feel bad for your roommates, one, and that's why you gained a pound. Yeah. And you're not going to shit for a day, but okay. So I think, so how do you approach it? And what signs do you have to figure out where a client is on that spectrum, either going towards, trying to fit in things for cravings or just trying to eat more volume?
Yeah, it's like a volume versus intensity debate, right? It's like the volume is the salad guy, and the guy that just wants that intense blast of flavor or perceived flavor, because Arctic Zero was terrible in hindsight. Yeah, what ends up happening is, if just like lifting, right? You go too far in one direction, it's going to break you, right? So again, it's always finding that middle ground. And to me, I determine where they're at based off like what they were doing, in the off season, when hopefully, they weren't hungry. If they were like terribly hungry, then that's a whole different animal and different things to talk about. But yeah, usually what you were doing in your off season, because that's when, the best time to learn good habits is when you have enough fat on you as a bodybuilder. That's kind of sort of the person I'm going to have to deal with. So the old school guys, they've done the menus, they've done the meal prep. With them, it's like, hey, let me pull you a little bit more in this direction. And for a number of different reasons, some of them you just described, we're going to have a better contest prep, because, hey, we're not having green beans pre-workout anymore, right? And then, the other way around, someone who is just kind of extra pliable, maybe overly neurotic when it comes to the tracking, it's like, oh man, this is going to turn like really freaking weird towards the end of your contest prep. And with those people, you do have to ask them like on a weekly basis, like, hey, can I just see what you're eating for a minute? Because you want a nice little balance of both things. And, once and you've said this before, once you've done this long enough and you've mastered both sides of the coin, there's less and less contrast between your off season and your on season. They're still different, but there's less and less contrast. And I can say that for you, I can say that for me. Like when we compare our old super bloaty off seasons and like what we were eating then, and then like the tail end of our first few contest preps, they're very different. And now, like fast forward, I'd say the first half of the prep, most people would not be able to really see the difference from afar, to be quite honest.
Absolutely. Steve, I want to bring you into this because I think the kind of the old school, especially non-dietitian perspective on this would have been, say, 2005 to maybe 2012 or even 13, is it's not my job to talk to you about your food choices. Here are your macros. And now, God, that seems like wholly irresponsible to not that you have to give someone a meal plan necessarily, but to not have a discussion about like, hey, like what does your meal composition look like? What's your structure? What foods are you selecting? How are you dealing with your hunger cravings? Are you having hunger cravings? That kind of thing. The old school perspective was just like, none of that matters. Just hit your targets, And I would love to know how much involvement do you have on that? What key things are you looking for? And like I was asking, Berto, how do you deal with clients who are, and you already touched on this to some degree, so don't feel the need to repeat yourself. How do you deal with the clients who are chasing cravings versus those who are chasing volume? And how do you discover that as well?
basically everything gets filtered through like questions. So almost every week I'll just ask, how is your appetite this week? And so if the appetite's good, I don't address anything. But then eventually, somewhere along the way, in the fat loss phase, like, yeah, I've noticed like I'm getting pretty hungry. And then from there, like we'll pull up their MyFitnessPal account, and like you said, we'll just kind of go through and look at food choices. And the other thing I always have people do is like track fruits and veggies. So it's like I can always see where their fruits and veggies and protein are at. So it's like first thing is like what I love about even the fat loss phase, even though it's not as aggressive as like a contest prep, like for somebody who's like never been like crazy shredded, like it feels like they're getting crazy shredded. And so it's like they may have been struggling to like hit their protein, fruits, and veggies, but they start getting hungrier. If I notice those things are low, I'm like, well, that's why we have the minimums in there. And so those are the first things I look at. If all that stuff is sufficient, then I'll kind of move to the MyFitnessPal, like I said, and look at like food choices, food selections. I don't know. I mean, and I'll look at like meal spacing. So typically just the line that I found is like no more than 5 hours without eating. Like we all know there's nothing magical about, if you wait longer or eat less than 5 hours, but it's just like, I find that like past that line, people just start getting super hungry most of the time. And that's when typically overeating occurs. So I'll kind of go through their day and just, hey, when do you eat first? When do you eat second? When do you eat third? When do you eat fourth? Whatever. And if I start noticing it's more than 5 hours, we'll throw a snack in there. Something like that.
No, I like that. Yeah, man. So I think I'm glad we're transitioning to talking about awareness of hunger and satiety. And I think this is something that can be a very, very useful tool, but at other time points in contest prep, at least for most people, you kind of just know the answer. And maybe it doesn't pay to focus on it. At least that's my take. I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on it. So for example, Steve, when we did our transitioning away from tracking thing, we were teaching people about rating their hunger. And I think that's actually a great off-season tool that I like to use and can even be used early on in prep or even during mini cuts to be like, hey, if we got a 1 to 10 scale of, ravenously hungry towards if you poke my tummy, I'll throw up. We probably want to hang out from like 4 to 6. And if we're eating a relatively balanced diet and we're reasonably active, and we have a good relationship with food, that's going to roughly result in weight maintenance, So we can push that up into like, 5 to 7. We'll probably be in a surplus. We shift that down from 3 to 5. We've got ourselves a deficit, that kind of thing. I think that's great. However, I think because most of our individuals who are recreational bodybuilders are looking for sustainable changes to their physique long term, we try to give them the most sustainable methods. And like you talked about, Steve, sometimes these methods aren't always sustainable. Like you get to a point, it's like, hey, I want to keep your diet sustainable, so I'm giving you an unsustainable step count. So there are always a little bit of a gimme for a gotcha, if you will, at some point, even for non-contest preppers. But for contest preppers especially, we get to a point where we have just robbed Peter blind to pay Paul. We've got someone doing 15,000 steps. We've taken their fat far below where we'd really like it to be. The only macronutrient we like the look of is protein, and they are constantly hungry. So I think in these cases, do you guys see value in having someone go, yeah, what's your hunger on a scale of 1 to 10? Or is it more so we're giving strategies to not focus on that? And I'm open to you guys necessarily disagreeing with me. My personal approach is often that I just have kind of an assumption like, yep, you're going to be hungry. I would like to know what you're doing to deal with that, because sometimes these weight loss stalls are because you are not cheating on your diet, because you are eating a ton of volume to hit your macros to just make it through the day, to get your ridiculous hunger level to ridiculous -1, just so you can make it to another day kind of deal. And that's fine, but I need to know that so that I see this, your arms are looking better, but your stomach's looking blurry and your body weight's going up doesn't necessarily mean that fat loss has plateaued. It just means that you have an unhealthy relationship with asparagus right now. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I need to know what's going on, but I'm no longer asking you to gauge your hunger per se. Where are you guys at on that?
I think contest prep, it depends on the athlete. So I go back to my first few contest preps. I think I've told this story before. I remember staring at relish, just because it was a pretty low carb diet, and just the light was just hitting like that bottle perfectly, and I'm just like, wow, like what would I do if I could just open that thing and just chug it here?
You are so beautiful.
It and you know how things just taste sweet to you, like you have a green bean, like and you're like, ooh, that one was extra sweet, you know. That one, you know, your daddy might have been what is it, a snow pea or something, right? So go back to that one. Then like now it's like I've teetered back and forth through like really hungry, really full, because that's saying like food is always going to be there when you're going through your first contest. Like you just don't understand that. Like I didn't understand that. Like it's like, yeah, that makes logical sense. But like right now I'm very concerned with like my now. And for a newer competitor, it's one of those things where it's like I monitor a bit closer because I don't want anything to happen, you know? And I might do things like, hey, you know what? We're going to take an extra day of refeeding, or we'll just up the baselines this week, you know, a little bit. And then we'll come back down the next week. So yeah, with the newer person who hasn't really experienced all those sensations all the way through, I'm probably a bit more careful. With newer competitors who've done this a few times, you know, you just have that dialogue with them about like, you know, does anything really fix this? Like, does this really go away? You know, like my last contest prep, yeah, I was a little hungry, but more than anything, like I knew in the back of my head that it's like, this is nothing that's going to fix itself with one meal. It's not going to fix itself with a week of eating enough. Like you're going to have to overeat for a few consecutive weeks, maybe a few months before everything kind of normalizes again. And then once you fully understand that, you're like, oh, okay, it's just kind of like a hot day, right? It's a hot day. It's like, what are you going to do? It's just hot, man. You know, it's just like move on with your life. It's hot, right? So yeah, it depends on the athlete. I think the more experienced, the more I pitch it to them from that perspective. But the newer ones, yeah, it's like a boxer at his corner. It's like, you know, are you going to be okay? You know, can I send you back in there? Do we need to adjust the plan in any sort of way? So yeah, I guess it depends on level of experience, because, you know, once you've done a few preps, it's just, you're okay with the suck. It's just kind of like, I know the first few times I exercise, or especially like lateral raises and things, I was like, that burn was just like, ooh, like that's nasty, you know? And like now it's like we actively look for that, and it's like a really good thing, you know? If our medial delts are burning, it's like, yes, I'm targeting them right. And same thing with hunger. It's like now when I do have those hazy moments, it's like, okay, yeah, you're burning the last of your body fat, so we're doing well, you know?
So, Alberto, it sounds like it's not that you're trying to ignore hunger or advise your clients to do that at that point, but more so, instead of having necessarily targets or thresholds or tracking it, you are there to help reframe what that hunger means for your clients, and you have those conversations to help them manage it. And I think that's exactly, I think about my own contest preps as they've evolved and my coaching, and that is 100% the strategy I take as well. I find that, well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a study on like a novice competitor versus an experienced competitor and see if there's actual differences in like ghrelin, you know, or like peptide Y or anything like that. Like, I don't know if they're physiologically experiencing less hunger, but I do know that the experienced competitor generally just doesn't put as much meaning into the hunger. Like you said, they know it's what's going on now. It doesn't mean I'm going to die. It doesn't mean anything. It is the way it's going to be. It will get worse, and then it'll get better. I'll get a little fat, and it'll be over, you know? And I think kind of having that foresight really can help with acceptance and managing anxiety. But man, I remember my first contest prep, I had never been that hungry, and it almost seemed like, you know, when you hurt yourself and you know it's not a minor injury, and you're just kind of like, oh God, something's wrong. I'm broke. This is a problem. Something needs to be done. Help me. You know, I think that's the experience of of hunger in your first contest prep. It's like, this is not normal. It's not right. I'm going to focus on it, freak out, and probably do something that's going to be counterproductive. If not actual food choices or going off my diet, just the amount of anxiety I'm under. And the role of the coach for those first-time competitors is to use your experience to help them normalize that and let them know it is going to be okay. But there's a difference between being told it's going to be okay and a difference between knowing it's going to be okay because you've literally walked that path before. And I think that's probably why experienced competitors don't need as much guidance there, don't suffer as much from that, and can push further because they're not having those kind of fear reactions as they push further. I mean, don't get me wrong, a first-time competitor or experienced competitor who's never been shredded will get to be a novice again once they start to see some new lines, as it'll get a level of uncomfortability they have not been before, and their body does weird stuff that they've not yet experienced. But yeah, is that an accurate representation of what you're talking about, Berto? It's essentially reframing rather than targets or thresholds or tracking?
Yeah, in a lot of this, actually, there's a lot of parallels with what Steve does with a lot of his people, because what you're doing is it's whatever the athlete needs, right? Depending on many things, right? You just slow down their thinking process a little bit for them, and you give them you facilitate them acquiring the skills so that, hey, when they do hit a rough patch, it's like, okay, let's go over what we talked about during that last check-in. So it's funny because like bodybuilders, they like to see themselves as like very distant from like the general population. It's like, you know what, there's so many parallels. It's just yeah, the intensity just picks up. And like Steve said, or Eric said, it's like for someone who, man, haven't been under 200 pounds since they were 12. Like, getting under 200 pounds is going to feel like shredded, So it's basically the same thing. It's like, hey, let's teach them to slow down, use the less primitive parts of their brain when things get hot, and the athletes who have the most control over that over the course of a contest prep tend to be the ones that not only get to their desired conditioning, but also on the way out, it's a smoother transition as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess in my situation, just because like the nature of their goals, like typically we don't run into like just that situation where it's like you have to just ignore everything because like even though it's like they're not used to dieting, like typically we never even get to that place, and like the rare times that it does, it's always like a good indicator of like we're probably like getting below what's sustainable for you. Because Pitt's like the question, man. Everyone's always like how lean can I be? And I'm always like, we'll find out. Like eventually, like you will hit a point where it's like it's just not worth the effort anymore. And so it's like for me, it's like I said, if we hit that point, it's like okay, it's time. We're done. We need to camp here. I had some other thoughts that were going along with that. Yeah, I will say I do the two other things that you guys that you hit on in terms of like making sure if somebody hasn't dieted in a while, that they're aware that like being hungry is just a part of the process, and like trying to reframe that, as you said, Eric, is like a good thing. Like, hey, that's a sign that it's working. Like, obviously, like in certain, like with certain people's backgrounds, I would not use that as a strategy, but like where I'm talking about, like it does fit. Somebody who's not used to it is like, hey, you can view that as a sign of like progress. Like you're a little bit hungry. That's a good thing. That means it's working, just because I know the context around the person I'm saying that to. The times that like things do get more sticky, typically people are good when their life is stable, but it's when stress from work jumps up or something happens or they travel, that's when things kind of get thrown off. And so typically the stuff I'm dealing with is like the stuff I wrote about in that article of like, okay, we just got to learn how to manage stress differently, because like you have a solid foundation and it's like things are good when it's smooth sailing, but then when the waves start crashing, that's when it's like things kind of fall apart. So that's why it's like, let's just address that habit. We fix that habit and then we can keep kind of sailing along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of going back to the very beginning where we talked about the macronater archetype, or the burrow diet archetype kind of person who has those very consistent habits. I think they both need to be able to do what the other one does. And I think the ability to get off a plane, take a quick trip to the grocery store, find what you need that works, that's non-perishable. Maybe all you have is a microwave. You don't even have a fridge at your place. And if you're like, oh my God, I'm used to getting, produce and yogurt, you're going to be kind of screwed, But if you know what you can do for that time, and if you also know, oh, okay, well, I'm going to be eating a lot of, like beef jerky or something like that, my weight's going to pick up because I'm eating a bunch of sodium. Like if you know what to expect, but you have a different set of habits on when you travel, and you know how to deal with it, and you know how flights affect your weigh-ins and your look and all that stuff, you are going to be okay. And I can say this from basically firsthand experience in 2019. I traveled so much during that contest prep that by the end, I was actually noticing that I would predictably look my best like 2 days after I got off the plane. And we had a number of times where I sent Berto my contest prep pictures, and he like, what happened? And I'm like, well, it was the combination of eating different foods, getting on and off a plane, then drinking a lot of water, and this is what I look like. It just forces this kind of little weird cleanup thing. And I have some weird hotel pictures where we're like, oh shit, like you don't look like you got jumped in an alley for this brief window, and we have an insight into, your progress, while all this other time we've been seeing the kind of this travel related hormonal changes, stress, food, you're off your circadian rhythm, all kinds of fun stuff. So, but the point is, well, that's interesting, is that I had a different set of behaviors and habits that I developed for travel than I had when I was at home. And I was very comfortable with them both. And I think it would be very natural for someone to just stick with really just their home base and then get into hot water, like you said, Steve, when the waves start crashing and you don't have that anchor, that's when things get tough or you slip up. And I think that is something that is our duty as coaches to help like game plan for someone in advance. Like when someone is got a show in 3 weeks, I don't wait till the week to be like, here's your peak week plan. I start talking to them multiple weeks in advance for what is peak week going to look like. Here's how our communication is going to change. Here's when you're going to check in with me. Here's the type of pictures I prefer. Here's what we do if you get to your hotel and the upload speed is so slow that you can't send me a video. Go to the bathroom, turn on the lights, give me a picture, put it here, and get me some pictures before Friday and then also on that day so I have pre and post I can compare to, that type of thing. Same thing when the season's coming up towards an end. Like we need to establish a new set of habits and behaviors for the recovery diet than we did for your season. So I'm not going to talk to you about that 1 minute prior when you're like, okay, sweet, got to go to BJ's coach and celebrate my season. I'm going to talk to you about that multiple weeks in advance so you know what's coming. You know what to do once you finish the dessert and you're getting the Uber back to your place or the hotel after that show, and then what you're going to do on Sunday and all the days after. So I think it's our job to facilitate the setup and the expectations for people when they're going to be walking new ground. And if we don't do that, then we ended up just finding ourselves in this very reactionary place where we might be giving good advice, but it would be advice we don't even have to give if we'd done our job in the first place. So a little bit of a mini rant there, but I think that's you kind of opened up a good little can of worms there, Steve. Berto, something I want to talk about. We mentioned earlier how there are some habits that you pick up during contest prep, which just stay contained into contest prep. And there are some habits which maybe we need to change in the off season, which will actually facilitate those transitions better. Something you do with a lot of your clients is that you give them kind of a Gaintenance phase, if you will, for a few months prior to contest prep, where maybe you give them like an upper end weight threshold, and you try to have them hang out at a reasonably lean, good starting point for a few months. You focus on some specific body parts, and I know you're trying to get them to facilitate certain behaviors. Can you talk to us a little bit about the utility of that phase and how you implement it and for whom?
Yeah. For the athlete, there's the off-season fighting weight, and that serves it's there for a lot of reasons. Your things are more predictable when you are like for sure like eating a little bit more than enough. So we get the most out of our training. You become okay with weight gain, which I think is important as well. So you're less susceptible to injury. there might be some argument for hormones being a bit more optimal, and you don't look exactly the way you want to look, at least not to a T. But mainly those first few ones. But we can't start a prep there quite often, because otherwise, man, that's going to be a little bit more weight than I'd like to drop. I don't like people dropping more than 15% of their body weight, if I can help it. So yeah, we'll have one of our usual cuts, get them a bit closer, and then, but still leave enough room where, hey, during that gaintaining month or months, we can gain a few pounds. It's maybe not as assertive as our usual gaining phases, but hey, we can work on a few body parts and really prioritize those things before we get into a contest prep. And what that phase tends to do, besides put us in a better position, is that, you start to, I find this especially with myself, like there's little things that I do that I just don't do in the off season. Little things like, I'm going to be extra on top of my sleep. Like there's no negotiations. No, I'm not going to watch another hour of that show. It's like, it's off to bed. A bit more organized about my eating as well, because, hey, again, it's like I want to be in that range when I kick off that contest prep. So it just makes you more mindful of all your actions and what you behave like when there is a little bit of turbulence there. So it's like an intro cycle to what the contest prep is going to be. And man, does it make it like smooth sailing, like once we do start. It literally feels like, okay, prep starts next week, instead of it being like this big halftime show that takes place. It's just like, okay, cut your food by 75 grams of carbs and the contest prep starts, and there we go. And it's that simple, and not a whole lot changes in their lives. And I think that's a big difference compared to, say, my first two contest preps, where it's like, okay, here I am doing the off season thing, and then, oh shoot, next Monday I get to start prep. And as fun and excited as I am to do that, man, it was stressful, right? It's like things got really, really serious all of a sudden. So it's a nice little intro into, if you're kind of new, establishing habits that are going to be useful when you do start your contest prep. And if you've done this a few times, it's like, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, I don't eat no Greek yogurt in the off season because it's just way too filling. And like, I open up my fridge and something about that image in my Greek yogurt that I'm like, oh yeah, it's like, it's go time, man. So yeah, it's obviously puts us in a better position physically, but then also when it comes to the mental side of things, it streamlines the process a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm. That was exactly my experience with approaching it that way in 2019. I did my last cut to get down to where I wanted to start prep in, I guess that would have been, September or August. And then essentially for the rest of September, October, and November, I was just trying to eat as much as I could without gaining any more than a kilo. And I was pretty pleased how that went, because I actually came out to, Texas, met up with everybody, and we hung out, and it was no issue. Like I was still on point, we did things like bring protein powder, and I made good decisions. And obviously it's easy hanging out with a bunch of other bodybuilders, of course. But yeah, the end of 2018, I was like, I get it. Like, I'm on point. I'm not having those days where I'm like, I'm at 1.6 grams per kg of protein. I don't need my Greek yogurt before bed. I just want to hit the hay, which is not a common occurrence for me in the off season, but it does happen. And that's something you just don't do when you're thinking about, like, this is me getting the right position in the starting blocks. You're not going to be like, I got one cleat on, I don't need both. Like when it's game day like that, in that little pre-prep period, and for me, when I have the right mindset, it's like, okay, I need to feel not dieted, but I need to be in the right position. I need to have all my habits ticked. And that really is what it is. I think it's a process-oriented, it should be, if done right, in my opinion, a very process-oriented time. To then, when contest prep starts, it is just like a removal of a carb source and a little bit of extra added fat. And you're off to the races. Maybe a little bit of added cardio post-workout or something like that. Where in previous years, you can tell for your clients or for yourself that you're anticipating this huge lifestyle change. Because what do you do on the weekend prior to that Monday start? You go out to eat like 3 times. It's silly, right? You actually manage to gain like half a pound of fat before you start your contest prep because you're anticipating that it's going to be this difficult change. And that's a very different mindset than I've got everything lined up, all my ducks are in a row, sweet, I can't wait to hit the go button, So I think that's a very interesting perspective, that there are some behaviors that we want to facilitate for prep, before prep, while there's other behaviors that we have to use to make it through prep, which really don't make sense after the fact. So it is a confusing thing, and I think this goes back to Andrea's presentation that she did when we did 3DMJ Down Under, of how like bodybuilding kind of makes you crazy because you have to have these 2 different sets of lifestyles. Going into contest prep, you have to live a certain way that is unsustainable because we have unsustainable goals. And then when we come out of it, we have to transition to something else. So I think it's really important as coaches to facilitate that understanding, first of all, but then also that habituation process, which, like we've talked about this whole time, is going to look different for the individual. So yeah, a bit of a kind of a summary rant of what we've talked about there. But yeah, just anything else that you guys want to touch on?
Well, I mean, it's semi-related. Again, just because a lot of the people who work with me find me through you guys, they have bodybuilding goals like deep down, even if they are a long way from competing, like 100 plus pounds. And so I'd be curious to hear, like, I know my kind of recommendation is like, hey, let's do this fat loss phase, let's go to maintenance, and then just like live there for like a year, like just really like reset. Like if you've lost all this weight, like before you just like take this thing and make this like a 125 pound fat loss phase into a contest prep, like get off all this stuff, get towards like you can be as lean as you can comfortably be, and like just like get used to maintaining that. And then almost like you guys are talking about like this, like getting ready for the prep and then prepping. It's kind of like this, I kind of have the same advice, like get yourself into a position where you can start a prep, but like live in that position for a while versus like blending this fat loss phase with a prep. I don't know if you guys would have the same advice for someone in that situation, but just the parallels as you were talking about that is like, oh, I kind of said the same thing. If somebody like wants to prep someday, but they've got a ways to go until they're kind of in a position to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo that 100%. And I would imagine even the 100 pounds isn't just this 2-year deficit either in most cases. I think like you were saying earlier, Steve, like, well, how lean can I get? We'll see. It really is, what approach do we take and how much can you handle? And then and sometimes if you take an approach that you can barely handle, but you lose the weight, I can guarantee you're just going to gain half of it back or more. So I think while during contest prep, that's a little less of a concern because we want to gain some of the weight back. Something that a good coach is doing is kind of keeping an eye on how much are you redlining it. And then at those points, that's when I'm going to choose to maybe have a diet break. And again, this is one of those times where it's like are we team diet break or team not diet break? What does the science say? Well, one thing the science does say is that it seems to improve hunger and adherence. So regardless of the effect on lean body mass retention, resting metabolic rate, total daily energy expenditure, or performance, this is a tool to allow us to push a little farther. Because ultimately, getting really diced goes back to the intro. It is just being able to sustain a calorie deficit, lifting weights, and absorb the suck for long enough. But even bodybuilders have their breaking points, and that's why we see these different eras of people with different levels of conditioning. So I'm a little bit tangential to your point right now, Steve, but I think it's a really important principle of assessing someone's burnout level with the fat loss phase and implementing strategies that reduce burnout but don't have us take too many steps backwards. Ideally, just hitting pause, which I think is the way I view diet breaks. And you could look at that for someone who needs to lose 100 pounds as quote unquote practicing maintenance. And you could look at it as a contest prepper as, you're swimming underwater and you're about to freak out and take a big gulp of water, and you go, let's stop swimming, put our head above water, just tread water for a little bit, take a big gulp of air, and then we go again. So I think the same principle essentially applies under just different time scales. But absolutely, if I had someone who had to lose, an amount of fat that would take them multiple years before they'd even consider a contest prep, there would 100% be some, let's not just have to establish a new set of habits every 3 months as your calorie intake changes by a couple hundred, but let's learn what it is to be 100 pounds lighter before we then go into this truly unsustainable level of fat loss where we lose another 30 or 20 or whatever.
Yeah. On that note, the whole playing to where a person is mentally, or just the nurturing aspects of fat loss, are just highly underrated. Like when you hear about team diet break or team no diet break, it's like, well, it's mostly for, psychological reasons. And like, as long as I've been working with bodybuilders, it's like everyone has a breaking point. Because I see everything behind the scenes. So it's like I've worked with some pretty impressive physiques where it's like, they break too, man. Like everyone breaks it. It's those who kind of like lifting weights, right? It's like, hey, we only add load when we're actually ready or something's gonna snap up. It's the exact same thing when it comes to deciding just how much you're going to put on that person when it comes to anything fat loss. And it's our job as coaches to just be honest with them in regards to like what they can handle, and it doesn't mean that like over time their ceiling's going to grow. So
Berto, one thing I think about is you talk about how everyone has a breaking point and people often do break. I think most people have a very narrow reductionist view of what that means. Like, oh, it means cheating on the diet. Yeah, but it might mean having a super unhealthy, like up and down food intake off season. It might mean they nearly get divorced every time they run a contest prep.
Yeah.
It might mean that they make some crazy ass life decision during contest prep because they've pushed themselves to a crazy point. They still got on stage, but you don't know what happened at work on Thursday and how involved HR had to be, like like these sound like, oh, the oddball outlier cases. No, they are not.
Yeah.
Like when someone redlines it for long enough, it comes out sideways somewhere. I would say the super stock standard, like what would I expect is, oh, I had an oopsie day. Like, yeah, that's pretty vanilla,
Yeah.
But there are many other flavors to breaking that it is hopefully our job, if we're doing it right, to make the client aware of, because a lot of the times you put up your blinders and everything is just focused on getting on stage, and then you kind of have to reassess the damage post prep, but maybe getting them sufficiently aware so that we can safeguard their overall holistic health and mentality and life, pointing out those blind spots and safeguarding against them totally blowing up certain aspects or reducing the magnitude of the breaking postseason. I think that's probably, I would say probably the second most common thing is that some people don't cheat on their diet, but they will have some issues after the prep. I'd say that's me. Like I don't cheat on my diet, but I will do things which I will have to pay for later,
Yeah. This is actually tangent, but one of the gifts I think of fat loss is that it shows you parts of you that are like actually there. Like they are there. It's just there's less filters. So they just happen. So it's a great time to learn about yourself. Like to me, that's always one of my favorite parts. It's like, oh, okay, that's right. You do that, bro. Like, let's knock that. let's keep that at bay during this contest prep, and during the off season when it's easier, it's like you probably still do that in some way. So let's get to work on that. Yeah.
My frequency of apologies to friends goes up during contest prep by an order of magnitude.
When I wanted to move to Colorado after my contest prep, my thing is I'll make a decision like, yep, that's what we're doing. And like there's no time to weigh the pros and cons. And you guys told me, hey, wait, let's wait 6 months before you actually decide if you want to relocate or not, which in hindsight was the smart thing. I ended up doing anyways, but it did build up a list over time, and I got to sit on that a little bit. So yeah, getting to know yourself, getting to know you, right?
Well said. So yeah, I think those are some fantastic closing words, so people understand the value in developing these habits, even if you think you or your system or your clients are immune to breaking the diet. There's just a lot of other ways that things can become problematic, if you will, and why it's important to set up the right environment, which truly comes from within, to be able to succeed. Hopefully that helps folks. Habit replacement, definitely check out the blog. It is tangentially related to this and very useful to give you a better perspective on it. And yes, coaches, competitors, we hope that you have a much more successful next season with some of these strategies in mind.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.